All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. This is the second in a series of webinars focused on strategies to protect drinking water from harmful algal blooms. I'm your meeting host, Tara Witzel from the U.S. Army Engineer and Research Development Center. I'm very glad that you could join us today. During our meeting, everyone will be muted, but we still want to ensure discussion is available, so please open the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. When submitting a question or comment, please select to send your message to everyone so that we can all see. To let everyone know, this meeting is being recorded. The video and slides will be posted on the NRM Gateway Learning Exchange, and I've posted the link to that in the chat box. Following all presentations, we will have a question and answer session. On behalf of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I would like to thank our partner organizations for contributing to this exciting webinar series, the American Waterworks Association, the North American Lake Management Society, and the Aquatic Plant Management Society. At this time, I'm happy to introduce our moderator, Chris Doyle. Chris, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Tara. Welcome to the second session of the Comprehensive Strategies to Protect Drinking Water from Harmful Algal Blooms. Today's topic is source water protection in the watershed. Last week, our very first in this series, we kind of had an overall, kind of a high-level look at harmful algal blooms. So now we're going to start diving into some specific topics. My name is Chris Doyle. I am representing the North American Lake Management Society. I am the current Region 2 Board of Director for NOMS, and I am a past president and past editor of the Northeast chapter of the Aquatic Plant Management Society. It's been my pleasure to be on the committee of partners that has organized this summer series of webinars, and today I'm going to be your moderator. I would like to acknowledge the partner groups really quickly. Without everybody's help in this endeavor, this series would not have been possible. I'd like to thank Jeremy Crossland, Tara Witzel, our host, and Elizabeth Quillen for filling in as our host last week of the U.S. Army Corps. Thank you guys for hosting this webinar series and also for producing behind the scenes and everything. I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Heilman and Dr. Ryan Wurzel of the Aquatic Plant Management Society. I'd like to thank Dr. Chiho Sham of the American Waterworks Association. And finally, I'd like to thank Lisa Borre, current president of NOMS, Danielle Wayne, and Alyssa Anderson for all of her help on behalf of NOMS. Today's topic is best management practices in the watershed, which are crucial to limiting external nutrient loading into our drinking water sources. Dr. Sousa will discuss how the watershed development impacts water quality, hydrology, and biota of surface water reservoirs. And then our second speaker, Dr. Marzoff, will provide an assessment of how Florida is approaching load reductions from agricultural areas. As Tara mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. And reminder, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and we're going to hold all the questions until both speakers have had a chance to present. So you can advance the slide, Tara. Our first speaker is Dr. Steve Sousa. He is the owner of Clean Waters Consulting. He is also a founding partner of Princeton Hydro, LLC, where he served as president for 20 years, retiring from the company in 2019. Over the past 35 years, he has dedicated his career to the management and restoration of aquatic ecosystems, in particular lakes, ponds, and reservoirs. Dr. Sousa received his BS from Dartmouth, his MS from Rutgers, go Scarlet Knights, and his PhD from UConn. Dr. Sousa has served over the past 25 years as an instructor and course coordinator for the Rutgers NGA AES Office of Continuing Professional Education, which is focused on the management and restoration of aquatic ecosystems, and he is also an adjunct professor at Temple University. Dr. Sousa is a past president of the North American Lake Management Society, and is a member of the newly formed New Jersey HAB expert team, and is a frequent guest speaker for the government agencies and entities dedicated to the protection and restoration and management of water sources. So it is with great pleasure that I turn over the presentation to Dr. Sousa.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. And yes, I'm going to jump right in on my presentation. We'll be talking, as Chris pointed out, about watershed management and the importance of that with respect to source water protection. Again, I'd like to extend my thanks to the partners for inviting me to speak today, and for all of you attending today's webinar. I know everybody is really busy. So what we'll be covering, I'm going to be talking about eutrophication risks and how those eutrophication risks are directly linked to watershed development. We'll talk a little bit about how to assess and quantify the impacts that are associated with watershed development, and then how reservoir managers can make use of that data to better protect and improve raw water quality. At the end of the day, what we want is really high water quality entering our plants. In doing so, that means less in-plant treatment needs and cost less reliance on in-plant treatment. So with that, let me get rolling. Back in 2008, NOMS came up with a great catchphrase that I have used repeatedly. A lake is a reflection of its watershed, and the same holds true for reservoirs. What's happening in our watersheds definitely has a direct impact on what's happening in our reservoirs. And this is because there's definitely a direct, intimate connection between reservoir water quality and what enters with respect to nutrients, contaminants, and sediment, as well as what's happening with respect to the hydrologic load. So nutrient load, pollutant load, and hydrologic load are all linked to reservoir water quality, and in turn, all of that is linked to watershed and watershed development. I know a lot of you have seen graphics such as this, but it's worth going over once again. In relatively undeveloped, doesn't mean pristine, but relatively undeveloped watersheds, I mean, we get a rainfall event of that total amount of precipitation falling on our watershed. Only about 10% of it ends up as runoff. As we start developing our watersheds more and more, we add more impervious cover, we start to compact soils, and that results in a greater amount of that precipitation actually emanating as runoff. And this doesn't occur just at, watershed development levels of 70%, 80% impervious cover. We start to see these problems with impervious cover levels as little as 20%, which is about on scale with what you would see for low density development residential type of development. Conversely, as we go from an undeveloped to a more developed type of scenario, less of that precipitation that falls actually infiltrates through the soil into the ground and serving as base flow. So we have a reduction in recharge. And that also presents a big difference, between a moderately developed and a more extensively developed watershed. And that, in turn, has impacts on our reservoirs. So what's the fuss? It's just a little bit of runoff. But when we see pictures like this, following some type of catastrophic flood or a large hurricane, people sit up and say, there's a lot of problems that come out as a result of rainfall and runoff. However, stormwater runoff, those problems are not just a function of what's happening during those extreme events. It's been my experience that stormwater runoff is typically the root cause of most eutrophication problems that I've had to deal with in lakes or reservoirs. And so from that, I've learned that better stormwater management ends up meaning less water quality problems. And as a result of that, I've made stormwater management a key element of all of my my lake management plans, reservoir management plans, and source water protection plans. Again, a lot of you that are hydrologists are very familiar with illustrations such as this. And basically what it shows is essentially when we have a rainfall event, a certain amount of that rainfall hits the ground and it gets soaked up into the ground. But in time, you end up generating runoff, and that increases the flow in the receiving stream. And eventually we reach a peak. That peak typically lags or occurs a little bit later than peak amount of precipitation. And then as the storm dies off, the flows recede and then reach back down to base flow conditions. This particular slide that I borrowed from Tom Schuler basically shows the differences, though, between what happens in an undeveloped or moderately developed watershed and a more highly developed watershed. And so our stream flows are much more jagged. It's much more of a roller coaster effect. And this applies not only for the large storms, but also for the smaller storms. So we end up with higher peak flows, more runoff. That results in more damage to our streams, more mobilization of pollutants, and more problems to our reservoirs. Now, as I mentioned before, we sit up and usually pay attention to those extreme events. But what this graph is essentially showing is that even, this is data collected from 1950 through 2010. And again, those of you who are hydrologists are probably pretty familiar with this. But not only have we seen major changes in the amount of precipitation measured in inches that are associated with the big events, the 100-year storm, the 50-year storm, but we also have seen significant increases in the amount of precipitation associated with the smaller events, the more frequently occurring storms, the half-year, 1-year, 2-year events. So it's not just the extreme events that we have to be concerned about. And basically for that reason, I've come to really think about it from this perspective. Yes, we want to sweat the big storms, but we really need to focus on the smaller storms. And why is because these smaller storms, the storms with a greater return frequency, as I said, the half-year, 1-year, 2-year events, they're generating more rainfall. And as a result of that, that means they're generating more runoff. That increases the opportunity to mobilize, transport pollutants as well as sediment and nutrients. And then with that, because this is more of a chronic repeating type of impact, it exacerbates various environmental stresses that are typically observed in the tributaries or streams that flow into our reservoirs. So yeah, we need to be really concerned and sit up and pay attention and sweat out those extreme events, but we really need to be focusing more on what's happening with the smaller events, because it's the smaller storms that result in these chronic repeating impacts that can be devastating to our reservoirs. So flooding, erosion, eutrophication, contamination, yes, as I said, all storms represent some degree of environmental risk. But with these chronic impacts associated with the smaller events, whether it's a function of localized flooding or stream scouring, those are the ones that we really need to focus on. So the next few slides just kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. Here we have, a result of hydraulic impact. So this is too much water coming at us too fast. This would be a function of rate, cubic feet per minute, cubic feet per second, however you want to measure it. And that ends up causing erosion problems. We have severe enough erosion problems that cause bank subsidence. With that, all that soil, that ends up washing into our reservoirs. With that comes more pollutant loading. And that's a function of just hydraulics. We also have hydrologic impacts, and this gets back to the slide that I showed the difference between the amount of runoff that's generated between a moderately and more highly developed watershed. We end up with flooding, that's on one side of the spectrum, and we end up with reduced base flow. So we've got too much water or too little volume that we're experiencing. This is again measured in gallons or cubic meters, acre feet, however you want to measure it. But this is a volume-based problem, whereas hydraulic problems are a rate-based problem. At the end of the day, we're still looking at, impacts to our reservoirs as a result of stormwater runoff. And in the U.S. right now, at least 70%, if not more, of our water quality problems are a function of non-point source pollution, and that pollution conveyed by stormwater runoff. And as I said at the beginning, what we want to do is make sure our raw water quality is protected as best as possible, because in doing so, it costs us less to produce quality potable water. Some other chronic impacts that result from this constant influx of sediment, nutrients, and contaminants into our reservoirs is eutrophication, which in this case, is just too many nutrients or too much nutrients. And then, perhaps at times some extreme type of conditions, fish kills that result maybe as a result of eutrophication, perhaps a result of a lot of organic loading, loss of oxygen levels in our reservoirs. And we can't forget about HABs. And yeah, we all sat up and, really paid attention when we had, a major HAB in Toledo, and that banned, drinking water, potable water, made some major issues for that community. But we're seeing this more and more. And there's definitely a direct link between HABs, stormwater, and stormwater pollutant loading. So yeah, at the end of the day, a little bit of runoff can create a lot of problems. And that's basically sort of like the context within which, I want to talk about what do we do about this? Well, I like to think about it, when we think about a watershed, is everything flowing downhill. And what happens at our watershed eventually affects our reservoir. And a lot of that is, especially pertains to land development, because as I illustrated previously, it alters the hydrology and the hydraulics of those streams and our inflow that is coming into our reservoir. Stormwater runoff mobilizes and transports pollutants. You layer on top of that perhaps other sources of contaminants and nutrients, industrial, commercial, municipal wastewater discharges. Those are other things that are happening in our watershed that is independent of stormwater runoff, but yet can be a contributing factor. We have septic system clusters, perhaps in our watershed, where we don't have sewer systems, and that can present a very large nutrient source. And then, as Eric will be talking about a little bit later, agriculture can generate a lot of nutrients as well as a variety of different types of contaminants. And then you put on top of all of that some of those extreme events that increase the catastrophic acute risks to our reservoirs. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to understanding what's happening in our watershed, because what's happening in our watershed directly and eventually affects what's happening in our reservoir. So, I try to simplify things as best I can when I'm dealing with, issues affecting my reservoirs and helping my reservoir clients. And I can sort of think of some of these risks as eutrophication risks that are tied into these small storms and smaller events, more frequently occurring events. On the flip side of the coin, the other end of the spectrum, I have these hazard risks that are associated with the extreme storms. And as I've mentioned already, I think of these eutrophication risks and small storm-generated risks as chronic impacts to my reservoir, and these extreme events as creating acute impacts. Now, today, we'll just focus on eutrophication risks, but part of any type of reservoir management plan needs to include risk management that's looking at what's happening because of extreme events, as well as the smaller, more frequently occurring events. Reservoir eutrophication, we're here today talking about this because of, concerns with HABs, but we all know that, particularly in the Northeast and throughout the majority of the U.S., the majority of our reservoir eutrophication problems are directly tied to phosphorus. And phosphorus-related problems are directly tied to stormwater runoff. When we have a storm event that increases the amount of dissolved particulate, organic, and inorganic forms of phosphorus, that includes a lot of quickly bioassimilated forms of phosphorus. And typically in a storm event, our total phosphorus concentrations are around 0.28 milligrams per liter, which is about an order of magnitude greater than what's needed to stimulate an algae bloom. Now, the majority of that nutrient and sediment loading that's coming into our water, into our reservoirs, yes, it's originating from external sources. We need to pay attention a little bit to internal sources as well, but we don't have time for that today. We'll talk about external sources. But with that in mind, we know that if we can decrease the amount of phosphorus loading from those external sources, we're going to have less of a eutrophication problem. So watershed management should be intrinsic to the management of your reservoir, and it should be part of your long-term protection plan for your reservoir and for reservoir water quality. So where do I start? Well, thou shalt know thy watershed. It's important to understand what is happening in that watershed because it's a reflection of what's happening in your reservoir. And that means figuring out the boundaries, the topography, land cover, land use, hydrology, pollutant sources, and pollutant loads. That's all part of understanding your watershed. Quantifying pollutant load, though, as well as quantifying hydrologic load, it can be very tricky. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of data. We need to account for spatial and temporal variations because that can affect what's happening in our reservoir. As you know, we go through seasonality. There's a growing season, and at different times of year, we're going to be more prone to algae blooms and to harmful algae blooms. I tend to try to focus, again, on phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. Those tend to be the three big problems for reservoirs. And now you could just go out and say, okay, I'm going to compute my annual total watershed load for these three different contaminants, phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. And you could stop there, and that would be fine. However, that's not going to really give you enough information to properly manage your watershed and manage your reservoir. So I tend then to break that down into sub-watershed specific loads. What's coming from different sub-watersheds that's feeding into my reservoir? And then layer on top of that, finding out for each sub-watershed, how much of that load is associated with a specific land use or some type of different land source category. And then because, again, of the seasonality of algae growth, in my reservoir, I want to break that down even further and start looking on a seasonal basis or usually on a monthly basis. What are the changes in sub-watershed loading? And then here's something that a lot of people don't think about, but kind of like taking all of that information and then evaluating it in terms of what's manageable and non-manageable. So I might have a reservoir that has a watershed that a portion of it is highly forested. Now, even from that forested portion of my watershed, there's still going to be nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loading. And if it's a large sub-watershed, it may be a significant load. But that's a non-manageable load. I'm not going to go out and cut down a whole forest to put in a basin to deal with that loading. I'd rather focus on the manageable components. What's coming in from perhaps a septic cluster or from a given developed portion of my watershed. So thinking about this loading from a manageable and a non-manageable perspective can help you better figure out where to put your resources, time, and effort. Same holds true with hydrologic data. And even though we can simplify it and say we're talking essentially about water in and water out, there's a lot more involved. We know that we have precipitation, what falls directly on our reservoir surface. We have groundwater, that base flow that's coming in. We also have stormwater runoff. All of that affects nutrient and sediment loading. The amount of water coming in and leaving affects flushing rate, which then affects the amount of pollutant retention, whether it's sediment that is deposited and is retained within our reservoir, or the time that nutrients remain in our reservoir that allows for assimilation of those nutrients by various phytoplankton, including cyanobacteria. Water in, water out can also affect water column mixing and stability, which then in turn can have a big impact on internal phosphorus loading. Our hydrologic data, although again you can do this on an annual scale, it really needs to be quantified seasonally. And in some cases, I've even done this on a storm-specific scale. So I know, for a one-year event, what's my hydrologic load as opposed to like a 2-year storm or a 5-year storm. And that can provide me with additional guidance with respect to where do I put my management efforts. Now, we could generate all of that data by doing a large amount of field data collection. And I'm a big believer in field data collection and sampling, but as we all know, there's an extreme amount of variability with that data, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to end up with a really good database. So typically, although I'm collecting field data, I need to supplement that and actually use as the primary source of my guidance data that I'm obtaining through models, so indirect quantification and estimation. And here's some easy-to-use tools that any reservoir manager can utilize to get a better handle on what's happening with their watershed. I provided you with some links to these various tools. A couple of them here are specific to New Jersey GeoWeb from New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and the climate data available from Rutgers. But on a state-to-state basis, you're going to have similar sources that you can tap into. So let's look at how we put all of this information together to give us a better understanding of what's happening with our watershed and how our watershed is affecting our reservoir. And so the first thing that I normally do is I use StreamStat to delineate my watershed and sub-watersheds. I then go in and make use of the USDA digital soil mapper to give me a better handle on my primary soils and slopes. That can have a big effect on how much runoff is being generated and also the amount of sediment loading. I can then make use of those data in combination with data that I obtain from my state's GIS database to start to map and quantify various types of land uses and different sources of potential pollutants. And then I can, again, use data that I can obtain from my local climatic data center to give me a handle on what's happening with monthly precipitation and evapotranspiration, so I can get a better feel and quantification of my hydrologic load. And then once I have all of that information, I can synthesize all of that using various pollutant loading models as well as trophic state models. In the trophic state models, the goal there is to essentially tell me how green is my reservoir going to be given all this pollutant, these pollutants that are entering, the nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. So I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples here. This is a reservoir in northern New Jersey, Spruce Run Reservoir. And quickly, this can be done in about like 10 minutes. I can easily delineate the watershed of this reservoir using StreamStats. I'll give you an example a little bit later on where I can use StreamStat to then generate sub-watershed data. Here, what I've done is called up the USDA soil mapper. I can overlay my delineated watershed boundary now over this map of soils, and now I've got a pretty good handle on what is occurring with my predominant soils, the nature of those soils, how they respond to precipitation events, slopes, etc. And then going into my state's GIS database, this is just one example of the type of data that I can obtain from that database. But here what I've done is I've mapped all of the streams and wetlands that are associated with Spruce Run and fall within the Spruce Run Reservoir. And then again, going back to my state climatic data, using the Rutgers rainfall, I tend to like to use long-term rainfall records, 30-year, 40-year records, because it takes out some of the annual variability. And then I can generate on a month-to-month basis the amount of rainfall. And then from that, using the land use data, the sub-watershed data, and the soils data, what I can expect in terms of inflow. And I'll show you another tool that sort of like combines all of that information very effectively. And that tool is MapShed. Some of you may be familiar with MapShed. This was created by Dr. Barry Evans of Penn State. It's now managed by Stroud Institute, but essentially it's a GIS watershed modeling tool. And as I said, it enables you to couple and pull together a lot of these various independent attributes of your watershed. One really neat thing about MapShed is that it does include a module, Predict, that allows you to go in and evaluate the effectiveness of various best management practices to reduce or decrease the amount of nutrient or pollutant loading coming into your reservoir. So at the bottom of this slide, I've provided a link to the MapShed tool. So sort of using Culver Lake, it's not a reservoir, but it's, for New Jersey, this is a relatively large lake, 539 acres or so, and just showing how those tools are all utilized in conjunction with each other to provide me with the basic information I need to properly manage this lake by understanding what's happening with its watershed. So here I've used StreamStat again to delineate my watershed and also my sub-watersheds, and then the DEP GIS database to understand the type of land use occurring within each of those sub-watersheds, or in this illustration showing a pie chart of what's happening watershed-wide with land use cover. This is the hydrologic load. This is basically the flow rates coming into into Culver Lake. This is cumulative based on all of my different tributaries, but again, broken down by sub-watershed by month. So now I got a very good handle on what's happening in terms of my hydraulic load on a monthly scale. And I can calibrate that data as I did in this particular example. The blue line is the Culver Lake generated data, model generated data, by comparing it to USGS flow records for either downstream stations, locations down gradient of Culver Lake, or for streams that are close to in the same regional area. And you can see here the model data and the field data match up pretty well. So I've got a pretty good handle on what's happening hydraulically with my lake, or you could do it for your watershed. And then again, the pollutant load via using the MapShed tool, broken down by sub-watershed. Here I'm looking at the amount of sediment, dissolved nutrient, dissolved nitrogen, total nitrogen, dissolved phosphorus, and total phosphorus as well. And this is a really neat attribute of MapShed. It tells me how much of my sediment is coming in as a result of bed and bank erosion. And that can be a very important component of your overall watershed management strategy. And at the end of the day, I end up with a pretty easy breakdown that I can use to communicate to my client and then understand as a lake manager or a reservoir manager where I need to be focusing my activities. And here I know what my external total phosphorus load is, what's generated internally, which I said we can't get into today, how much comes in via direct precipitation, and in this case, my septic loading. But all of this has been generated through a combination of MapShed and those other tools that I presented previously. And then with that, I can interpret all of this data, having my hydrologic data and my pollutant load data, to figure out how green my lake or reservoir is going to be using a simple model, in this case, the Dillon-Rigler model, which tells me at the beginning of the growing season how much total phosphorus I have, and therefore how green my reservoir is going to be, how productive it's going to be. Okay, but how do I use all of this? I've got all this information now. How do I use it? Well, yeah, I'm going to admit that watershed management is a challenge for most surface water supply systems. And why? First off, it's a scale thing. Large contributing watershed with multiple tributaries. That makes it difficult right there. Secondly, we typically lack direct control of the majority of our watershed. We have other municipal entities that are managing what's happening, in their portions of the watershed, and that's out of our direct control. And then, I run into this a lot. There's no regulatory driver. There's nothing saying, we want to protect source water quality, and these are the rules that are in place. You may have a TMDL, but how often is that TMDL really implemented to the point where we're seeing significant pollutant load reductions? So yeah, it's a challenge, but you can still use this data and use it, in a very productive way. First off, having all this at your fingertips provides you with a way of making really good reservoir management decisions. It enables you to understand how raw water quality can change seasonally, and then how to prepare yourself to respond to those changing conditions. Understanding the sources, the quantity, and the timing of nutrient and sediment loading enables you to plan for the worst, but at the same time enables you to put into play, measures that may start to reduce that loading over time. And the quantification of loading by source enables you to then focus management strategies, the amount of funding that you may have available, to really either hit on the major sources of nutrient and sediment loading, the chronic sources that cause these repeated problems, or maybe in some cases there's some low-hanging fruit and you can go after those, but you won't know without having this data at your fingertips. So a lot of you are familiar with adaptive management. I borrowed this from ESSA, but I like to think of it as sort of like, managing on the fly, but it does provide you with the ability to embrace for the uncertainty. But in order to do that, you need to have the data in hand to enable you to plan, to learn, and then to do. And I like to think of it from the standpoint that I'm going to react, but react in a way that enables me to prevent, control, and reduce. So the focus of my attention, is going to be on root cause management actions. These are things that are going to limit phosphorus loading in particular. But this data can also put me in a position that because I know when I'm most likely to have a bloom in my reservoir, I can start to implement measures that prevent or control, an HAB, or if I do have an HAB, what should I be doing to reduce the severity of that, either through algicides or through some type of sonic device or other type of in-reservoir management control or implementation action. Having all this data in hand also allows you to work very closely with the community. And some of that may be on your end alone, going out and seeking watershed management and stream restoration funding, independent of what's happening elsewhere in the community. I also have used this extensively as part of my education and outreach with the community, emphasizing to them, here's your reservoir that's supplying you with your drinking water. Here's how green infrastructure, stormwater management protects that. Here's things that you can do as a homeowner via septic management to protect that source water. You can also use this to maybe participate in grant applications with municipal entities, an NGO that's within your watershed or oversees your watershed. And then in some cases, you may also, you may have some of this data and it may provide you with a way of actually, funding independently with your community various types of pollutant load reduction strategies like green infrastructure rebates, whereas, you pay folks or you cover some of the costs associated perhaps with building rain gardens. So there's different ways that you can use this data and use it very effectively to protect your watershed. So in summary, what happens in your watershed, unfortunately, is typically a major driver of reservoir eutrophication, and that includes problems associated with HABs. We all know that development increases runoff, and with that, there's a whole series of risks. Some of those are a function of extreme events, but the majority of them a function of those smaller events, and that increases that eutrophication risk to your reservoir. But by knowing what's happening in your reservoir and using that data systematically, you can end up putting yourself in a position where you can be a proactive manager of your reservoir's raw water quality and not reactive. Understanding why this happens puts you in a position to prevent it from happening, as opposed to just saying, I have a bloom now, I have to do something about it. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is implement these measures so that we can maximize raw water quality, because with that, it minimizes reliance on in-plant treatment, and that saves money, saves effort, and provides you with a more sustainable source water. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'll turn it over to back over to Chris and to Tara, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sousa. I've literally listened to you speak dozens of times over the years, and every single time I listen to you speak, I learn something new, and this was definitely no exception. So thank you very much. We are going to hold questions until the end, but feel free to put those questions in the chat whenever you have them. You don't need to wait to put those in. We do have one real quick question that's been thrown in here by Ginger, and Ginger just says that she missed several of the links and asked if the presentation will be made available afterwards. Yes, it will be. The link is actually in the chat. Both the video recording and the slides will be available. So if you missed anything, you will be able to get those. So now we're going to get the Florida perspective on watershed management, and that's going to be provided by Dr. Eric Marzoff. He is the director of the Division of Water and Land Resources with the St. Johns River Watershed Management District. And there he oversees the data collection, land management, and ecosystem restoration planning. In this role, he works on integrating aquatic and terrestrial restoration and management efforts to meet the district's core missions. And he is the former NOMS Region 4 Director. So it's a great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Marzoff. Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and thanks to the organizing groups, and Tara, Chris, and Steve for setting things up. Let me get my presentation. Hopefully that's all in view for you now.
Everything looks good and we can hear you great.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk today about is Florida's approach to reducing nutrient loads that are coming from agricultural areas. Oops. So Florida takes a multi-scale, multi-level approach to addressing runoff from agriculture. There are things that we do on the farms, BMPs, more advanced BMPs. We also are looking at alternatives to farming particular crops, so how we might adjust what crops are being grown in an area, and in some rare instances, buying out of farms in particular areas. And then we're looking at regional treatment, which captures ag runoff between a producer's location and the water bodies of concern. And there are a variety of ways we're trying to accomplish that. So Florida's approach to water quality management is a recurring cycle, like it is in many places, where we set water quality standards for different types of water bodies. We monitor and assess water bodies, compare our standards to the data we've collected, and determine which water bodies are impaired. For those impaired water bodies, we develop total maximum daily loads, or how much pollutant is coming into a water body. And you can see on the map on the right, all the water bodies outlined in blue, which have adopted total maximum daily loads. So in those locations, we've set up, we know here are water bodies, here's how much nutrient or contaminant they can accommodate and remain healthy. Here's how much is actually coming in. And the difference then is our reduction goal. And how we implement that reduction goal is through the process of developing what we call Basin Management Action Plans, or BMAPs. And those are essentially putting together, assembling the projects and approaches that we're going to reduce external loads to meet our water quality standards. So the term BMAP is one that it usually is referenced as best management practices, and it's one I really dislike because it suggests to me that what we've got now is the best we can do, and there's really no room for innovation. And I think we all recognize that we are very innovative and creative, and we're constantly coming up with new ways to address things. So I like the term better management practices. So in Florida, once a BMAP, different from a BMP, a BMAP is adopted for a particular watershed or springshed, all the agricultural producers within that area must sign a notice of intent to do one of two things: either monitor and demonstrate that their runoff is not contributing to the problem. That's a very difficult thing to do. Or implement measures that are in the appropriate BMP manual that the state has developed. And one of the advantages of implementing the BMPs is that gets the grower a presumption of compliance with all water quality standards. So the BMP manuals are developed for different sorts of crop types within Florida, and they really address two different things. One is nutrient management, which is the amount, timing, placement, and type of fertilizer, and then irrigation. How do you ensure that you're getting the water into the right place at the right time and you're not overwatering? And these documents are living documents. They are updated and they are evolved. Again, a reason, I think, to reference these as better management, not best management. And these manuals for the different commodity types are available from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So what are they? They're practical measures that can reduce the amount of fertilizer, pesticide, waste, or other pollutants entering our water resources. And critically, they must be both economically and technically feasible for the producer to implement. And they are developed by the Florida Department of Agriculture and verified by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So there are some limitations, though, with these Ag BMPs. They are developed by commodity and apply throughout the state. So they are not site-specific, so they're not designed to meet specific water quality goals for a particular TMDL or BMAP. And they don't obligate a specific load reduction allocation. Therefore, we've got watersheds where, say, they're extensively agriculture, or they have atypical conditions, and a common one we encounter in Florida is that instead of it being a watershed with surface runoff, it's a spring shed where the water goes directly into the groundwater and there is no surface runoff. And so there are places where water quality goals are not going to be met by the BMPs alone. So that gets us to the second rung in our hierarchy, and that's advanced BMPs. So these are not in a manual. They are not required, but many agencies, including our Water Management District, provide cost share to incentivize the adoption of these practices by growers. So let's talk a little bit about some of those. And first, from my bias working for a water management agency, is to recognize the tight linkage between water use efficiency and nutrient use efficiency and runoff. Over-irrigating has a number of detrimental effects. From the grower's perspective, it can wash away nutrients, wash them out of the root zone, create runoff, and then that runoff creates all the problems that Steve outlined so eloquently. So from our perspective, regulating water use, but also having a core mission of water quality, recognizing this linkage between water use efficiency and nutrient use is critical to our work. And again, cost share is often available for the implementation of many of these advanced BMPs. So one of these is precision irrigation, and that's got a number of benefits to the grower, and it reduces their pumping costs, whether it's electrical or diesel pumps. That costs money to run them. You want to retain the applied nutrients you've invested in and keep them in the root zone. You don't want to wash them off in a surface runoff or into the aquifer. And also, over-irrigating is one of those activities that can incentivize or accelerate plant diseases or pest problems. So precision irrigation offers a number of benefits. So one common irrigation technique is the center pivot, and we're seeing an evolution from the kind of rainbird type sprinkler heads that sit on top of center pivots and send out a long spray with many tiny droplets to these drop nozzles you see here on the left, which have a number of advantages in that they're closer to the ground, they create bigger droplets, and they can individually be controlled, all of which reduces the amount of evaporation that occurs. And if you've got a smart system associated with your irrigation system, then you have the ability to tailor the water delivered based on changes in soil type within your field or water needs or what other types of data you may have that would guide a more thoughtful irrigation of your crop. Another common advanced BMP is simply the automation of pumps. In many of our agricultural areas, a grower might come on or a worker come on and turn on an irrigation pump in the morning, and they intend to get back to it later in the day to turn it off. And sometimes things happen and the pumps run longer than they originally intended. So having a system where you can automate or make on telemetry controlling the pump has a number of big advantages in that you can now control these remotely. And you can see that on the left and right side of controllers for these pumps, or begin to add more advanced data collection like a weather station, which you see in the center. And now we can bring in rainfall and soil moisture to help guide how much use we make of irrigation pumps. And now we add the ubiquitous smartphone and smart controllers and other data such as soil moisture probes, soil conductivity probes, and now we're putting in the hands of growers ability to know what's happening in their fields in real time. They can see within the root zone the amount of moisture. Conductivity is a useful surrogate for nutrients, the ionic form of nitrogen and phosphorus. And so you can see, based on conductivity, am I washing my nutrients out of the root zone of my crop? So adding this ability for the growers to control their pumps more precisely provides a lot of benefits. Here are some examples. On the left is a multi-level conductivity moisture probe in a peanut field. In the middle is a similar sort of setup in a blueberry container, and then a weather station and telemetry in a different field. So from that, the grower gets a lot of information, and a lot of progress has been made in making this information easier to digest and more actionable for producers. So in the bottom panel, you can see in the blue that following some rain events, there's plenty of water in the soil, and it begins to dry out as there hasn't been any rainfall. And as the conditions get dry and the soil moisture drops into the red, they turn on their irrigation system. And this sort of ability to be smart about when you run your pumps, remember, has big implications for water runoff, but also the movement of nutrients. And here's another example that brings in those nutrients where you can see things were good. A 3-inch rain comes along, greatly increases the amount of moisture into the blue zone on the bottom panel. And on the top panel, which is conductivity, you can see the conductivity decline, indicating that nutrients are moving and potentially being leached below the root zone. Again, rainfall is not something you can control, but having this information available certainly indicates this is not the time to be running irrigation pumps. Here's another example. Florida has a lot of foliage production, and here in this greenhouse, they have a closed loop, essentially, water cycle where plants are grown in trays. The trays are provided with water and nutrients. Capillary action draws the water into the containers. As the water flows around, it goes back and is collected, filtered, assessed, and reused by the grower. Here's a particularly creative grower that is combining hydroponics and also fish production, tilapia growing. So they are then using the nutrients released by the tilapia as a water nutrient source to then grow their hydroponic crops. So the flip side, the other advanced BMP is now focused on more precision in how you apply fertilizers. In the bottom left, you can see the drop PVC pipes. So as an alternative to broadcasting fertilizer application across the whole row, we can drop it just where it needs to be adjacent to the plant. And in the lower right, you can see a fertilizer applicator with its booms folded in. Again, it has specific locations along that way where it can precisely dole out the amount of fertilizer needed. In the upper right, you see a fertigation tank, and that's where folks are combining fertilizer with their irrigation water, and they can change that throughout the season based on the growth of their plant, the plant's needs for nutrients. They can meter out just what is needed. And then in the top center is a display from a modern tractor where you've got both highly accurate GPS and the ability to bring in additional data that provide you insights on how to apply fertilizers. This is a citrus example. Florida has a lot of citrus, even in spite of citrus greening, which is a really terrible disease impacting the industry. But in part because of citrus greening and the need to replace trees, some groves have trees of multiple different sizes. Historically, the practice would have been to give every tree the same amount of nutrients, assuming that need was the same. But you can imagine a smaller tree like this one is needing less nutrition than the one on the right or left. And here we're bringing LiDAR technology to the applicator. So a LiDAR sensor, we're seeing both for generating watershed topography and also for self-driving cars, is now sensing the biovolume of the tree. And based on that biovolume calculation, it's adjusting the amount of fertilizer that's going to be applied. And on the left, you can see jets that would be applying a liquid foliar fertilizer. And on the right is a blower that's blowing solid fertilizer, pellet fertilizer. And it's really better illustrated in these videos here, where on the left you can see just a constant dose being applied, whereas on the right, the intelligent spray, the different pulses are being adjusted by the sensor's identification of which trees are bigger, where the trees are bigger. So different shaped trees, different sized trees are getting a different application. We're also making a lot of advances in using data on nutrient availability in the soils. So back in the day, you would go into a field, sample in a couple locations, and composite that and get a kind of a field average nutrient availability and then adjust your fertilizer application accordingly. Now we're doing less using more individual samples with GPS coordinates and building a map, a more detailed map of nutrient availability. So then your nutrient needs from fertilizer can be more precisely metered out, and you can go from this map of available nutrients, plug in a thumb drive of that map into your tractor, and it's going to adjust the amount of fertilizer that's being applied as you drive across the field, so that only the amount of fertilizer that's needed is being applied in any one location. And this is an example of how another example of equipment that is doing that. Each of these individual drops is applying fertilizer, but each one is doing so independently and can take into account available data on the size of the plants or available nutrition already in the soil. Whatever data the grower may have can be used to more precisely apply. So now I want to talk a little bit again back to irrigation. In one of our big ag areas locally, we use a lot of seepage irrigation, where essentially you have irrigation rows about every 60 feet. You fill that, and through capillary action, you hydrate the whole field. This is quite ineffective, inefficient, and we're moving more towards now using something that's used a lot in the Midwest, but here we're putting a little modification on that, and that's putting in drain tile. And instead of having just the drain tile being an open pipe to a disposal ditch or a ditch at the edge of the field, we've got riser structures, and we can control the height of the water level by adding water through the drain tile, and control the elevation in the soil column by adding or removing boards at the water control structure. So this allows us to more precisely keep water where it's needed in the root zone and not flush out excessive nutrients. When that water is leaving a field in the drain tiles, it's now more easily collected. In this example, we're putting in a denitrification bed that will hopefully take any nitrate that's being lost from the fields and create conditions for denitrifying bacteria to put that nitrogen back as N2 and into the atmosphere and preventing it from running downstream. So now let's talk about some changes in crop conversion. As I mentioned earlier, one type of the landscape where the current BMPs are really challenged is in spring sheds. The map on the right shows, outlined in yellow, is a very flat area, and it has no surface runoff streams. All the rainfall, all the irrigation in this area goes straight down. So any sort of BMP that's based on buffering a stream channel or capturing or attenuating stream in a surface flow just doesn't work here. The chart in the middle is a real-time nitrate sensor in the spring, and our goal for springs is 0.35 milligrams per liter nitrate, N is nitrate. And you can see in this spring, we're running about 6 milligrams per liter. So this is a place where the current ag BMPs are just not adequate in addressing. So we asked the question, maybe in some of these key areas in the spring shed, we could create economic incentives to have some of these growers convert from water and nutrient intensive crops to, say, trees or other things. We've tried this a couple times. We haven't got the economics right because we haven't got any takers yet. But it is something that we continue to work on and talk with growers about how do we make this an economically viable option. Buyout is another tool that we have used. The map on the right shows an area the headwaters of the Ocklawaha River, which has a number of lakes. And in the 40s, associated with the war effort, a number of floodplain wetlands around these lakes, shown in yellow on the map, were diked off and drained and put into agricultural production. Well, you can imagine that was very attractive to the growers. These are wet, highly organic soils, up to three rotations per year. But the fact that they were right next to water bodies meant the runoff from these areas was really impactful. And so in a number of these areas, we went in and with willing sellers bought out the farms and are now in the process of restoring these areas back to wetlands, and in that way reducing their nutrient load to the water bodies. One example of an unwilling is on the far south end, Lake Apopka, and in that area, that was an area where the legislature directed us to buy out the farm businesses because of the impact they were having on Lake Apopka. And in that instance, this has been highly effective in reducing the amount of phosphorus coming into the lake. The graphic in the upper left shows the progression of the development of farms. We were able to demonstrate that not only was the vast majority of phosphorus in the lake coming from farms, but also that it was about a 7-fold increase over the ambient conditions. So restoring that area back to wetlands and reducing that loading has been very efficient. Here's an aerial shot of that area, black peat soils, highly productive. Growers were able to get 3 rotations per year of various crops. In this busy chart, the bars are the annual loading to the lake. The red hatch bars are from this agricultural area. The blue line is our loading goal, and you can see over time we have greatly reduced the phosphorus loading from that area. And now, since about 2009, we have met our loading goal for the lake, largely by the buyout of those farms. So finally, let's talk about regional treatment. And these come in a couple different flavors. Here are some examples of runoff coming into the St. Johns River from a couple large agricultural areas. In these instances, we've built a combination of retention pond and treatment wetland that captures surface flow coming off these areas from the ag areas before it reaches the St. Johns River, which has had real problems with harmful algal blooms in the past several decades, although it is getting better, in part based on examples like this where we're reducing the loads. And this is data from one of those 2 regional stormwater treatment systems, Dog Branch. The blue line on the top is the rainfall input, and then on the left, the green is the total phosphorus coming through to the system, and the red bars are the amount of phosphorus that's removed by the system each year. The black line was our goal. And you can see the system is functioning well. It is highly driven by rainfall coming in, mobilizing nutrients coming off the fields. And the chart on the right is similar, but for nitrogen rather than for phosphorus. So these regional treatment systems have been effective. The cost was we had to buy land that was in production and build these treatment systems. Another approach that is being under construction in various parts of the state is public-private partnerships. So these are long-term agreements on private land to capture and treat water. There are two models kind of being used now in South Florida. The model is growers can create impoundments on their property where they can collect water that's flowing past them on its way to a water body of concern, and they get paid for the storage volume they've created. In North Florida, we're taking a slightly different approach, where we're a more engineered approach, where the growers are building a nutrient reduction impoundment or wetland, and we're actually paying them for the mass of nutrients that's removed. So it's a little more data intensive in that we need to know the flow in, flow out, load in, load out. But it's a way for some of these producers that say their groves have been too impacted by greening to put these lands into productive use, improving water quality, and help reduce the loading to downstream water bodies. And here's an example of one of those that is under design. The area in blue is an ag area. The red is the outline of where the proposed reservoir will be, and it will be capturing runoff from both the ag area and some adjacent areas and putting it as an outflow into a tributary that would otherwise be going to the Indian River Lagoon, which is another one of our impaired water bodies where we really need to reduce the amount of nutrients and fresh water reaching these areas. So this is a public-private partnership that's under design and permitting now. And finally, this is a project we've done with the Corps of Engineers, and it's been a multi-decade project over almost 250 square miles, where this area that was the headwaters of the St. Johns River was highly ditched and drained for agriculture, with much of that runoff going in ditches to the Indian River Lagoon that doesn't want the fresh water, doesn't want the sediments, doesn't want the nutrients. And so we've been rebuilding wetlands and impoundments within this area with the Corps, primarily as a flood protection project. But we have built into it, within the constraints of the flood project, water quality treatment, water supply, habitat for fishing and hunting, and it's really been a fantastic partnership where we have really addressed a lot of our core missions working within the Corps' flood protection mandate. So a really nice example of a large-scale project, but it's one that has been very successful. And with that, I'll just conclude by, these cost share. It's certainly important to help fund these innovations, but I think even more important is the development of a conversation that goes on with these growers, where once they are doing something, their neighbors are curious. Once they begin doing things, they become more curious about what else might be done. And so it really puts us on a trajectory of improving our overall water and nutrient use efficiency. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Marzoff. Wow, that was enlightening. Florida is a completely different world when it comes to watersheds. I don't envy you one bit, some of those challenges that you guys have to overcome down there. We have one question in the chat. Oh, it looks like we have one question in the chat right now. So if folks have any more questions, please get those in the chat. We have about 15 minutes. I have a couple of other questions that I might pose too. This first one is for you, Eric, and this is from Angela. What is your regulatory authority in Florida to require notice that a specific farm isn't having an impact or requiring BMP implementation?
The growers are required by statute to implement the adopted BMPs for their commodity. in areas where there is an adopted basin management action plan, and that is a statutory requirement. And from a water management perspective, one of our regulatory angles is that we permit the consumptive use of water. So if a grower comes to us and is wanting a lot of water in an area that's water stressed, and they're not going to be implementing a very efficient technique, that's going to start a conversation about how they might want to change and use technology that is more water efficient. So that's another regulatory angle that is part of the conversation.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. So I have another question, and then I have another one for Steve. Hopefully Steve is still on. You mentioned crop conversion. Can you go into a little bit more detail on exactly what crop conversion is? And also you alluded to the fact that none of the participants in that program seem to be biting on that. And maybe you can share maybe some insights on why you think that might be.
Well, the idea, within spring sheds are particularly challenging because there's really no good way to intercept the runoff because it's going straight down. And so one of the things we thought about, just let's reduce the mass of nutrients being applied. And one way to do that is to say, switch from corn to pine trees. And, a crop, pine trees, that maybe you fertilize at planting, but really that you don't after that. But it's a very different sort of crop to be growing. If you're a corn farmer becoming a forester, it's not an obvious path. And the economics are also very, very different. So, it's something we've tried. It's something... It hasn't worked yet. We haven't got people to see it as a viable model, which to me suggests we haven't got the economics quite right yet. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying in various places. And so periodically we'll put out within this boundary, here's an opportunity if people are interested in, maybe someone's retiring and now wants to grow trees and not work so hard. This would be an opportunity. So it's not something that's worked yet, but we're not quite ready to throw in the towel on it.
Gotcha. Excellent. Thank you. So this next one is for Steve, but Eric, certainly after he's done responding, if you have anything to share, this would be great too. Steve, you mentioned it's obviously difficult to manage a watershed that you don't completely own or control. Can you maybe share some insights on some stakeholder interactions that you've had, and maybe like a success story where you've actually been able to encourage stakeholders and watershed owners, watershed landowners to actually buy into a program where they're doing some alterations in the watershed to kind of benefit a surface water that might be part of the watershed?
Yeah, I wish I did have a go-to, success story. I think most of our successes have been really, relatively small scale, where we've been able to, work with communities to encourage primarily green infrastructure stormwater management on an individual scale. So that it's been slow. And it's been slow because I think a lot of times there's not always the direct connection between what I do benefits me. When we're dealing with a reservoir, somebody turns on their tap and they expect to have clean water, but they're not really thinking that they could be part of the problem that, that prevents that clean water. So I think for the most part, our where I perhaps have had some, and I have to say, honestly, limited success with reservoir clients has been really with engaging the communities through outreach and trying to, get them aware of what they do affects their drinking water, although it may not seem to be, in a direct manner. Now, I've had greater success with lake communities because even though maybe the whole watershed isn't under their control, there's a direct positive correlation between a clean lake and, them being able to recreate, et cetera. So, with some lakes that are located within a municipality and the lake community doesn't have complete control over what happens in that municipality, we've had far greater success in that capacity because it's easier to, I think, engage at the grassroots level. And then some of that can also be almost transferred to for the municipalities, that the tax rate for these lakefront homes and people that live around lakes are a function of how the quality of the lake. So we've had plenty of opportunities there where we've been able to get towns to kind of come in and do combined grant applications. In other cases, actually implement stormwater management improvements, even though it's one lake within a large community. So I've got better success there than I have had with my reservoir clients.
Got it. The same question for you, Eric. Any success stories with dealing with watershed control to benefit a surface water? I think you kind of touched on a couple of the examples that you had in there, but
yeah, one wrinkle for much of Florida, and certainly dominates in North Florida, is the fact that most of Floridians get their drinking water from groundwater. Surface water intakes are relatively rare, so being impacted by HABs is not terribly common for drinking water. One exception to that is the city of Melbourne, which pulls water out of Lake Washington, and one of the things that we are working on and trying to connect wastewater management and drinking water management is in parts of the watershed above Lake Washington. Municipal wastewater plants have been disposing or using on agricultural fields their biosolids. And that has led to a pretty dramatic increase in phosphorus concentrations, to the point in some of these dark water lakes, we are seeing HABs and microcystis blooms, and that has got the attention of the city of Melbourne, who's running a drinking water plant, because all of a sudden their treatment costs are being impacted. So we're trying to have that conversation on a broader scale that, yes, that may be the cheap alternative for the wastewater managers, but for the drinking water managers, that's really not the solution they would like to see. So we're trying to work towards something that works better for everybody.
Thank you. That was great. I have family that lives in West Melbourne, so that gives me something to talk about at our next family get-together. So thank you much. I would like to thank both of you for taking time out of your busy schedules. I understand this is not an ideal time of year. This is up in the north. It's the growing season, and everything's happening up here. It's probably hotter up here in the Northeast than it is in Florida, believe it or not. It's like 96 today. So I do thank both of you. I would like to remind everybody that our next session is a week from today, July 7th, and we're going to be talking about mitigation of internal nutrient loads in drinking water sources. So definitely a different topic, and hopefully we will virtually see everybody then for that. And with that, I would like to say thank you to everybody, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you again.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chris, for co-hosting and for being the moderator. And I am just going to do a few things on my end to close out.